high above the misty peaks of the encircling mountains, where the stars seem close enough to touch, lies a secret so precious it has been guarded for centuries, the shining city of Gondolin. Its white towers glow like pearls under the moonlight, and its streets hum with the quiet pride of the elves who call it home. But tonight, as King Turgan gazes from his high balcony, the air carries more than the scent of blooming Elanor flowers. It carries a whisper, a shadow of something darker stirring beyond the hidden valleys. Wherever you're listening from right now, whether it's late night where you are, or perhaps the first light of dawn, we'd love to know what time your own journey into this tale begins. Let us know in the comments below, because tonight we step together into one of Middle-earth's most heartbreaking and heroic stories. This is a tale of beauty and bravery, of a kingdom so fair it was said to rival even the glory of Valinor itself. Yet it's also a story of secrecy, of a king's impossible choice. Turgan knows the truth. As long as Morgoth, the Dark Lord, hungers for dominion over Middle-earth, Gondolin's peace is fragile. Every guarded pass, every whispered warning among the elves is a thread in a fragile web of protection. And yet, can any secret stay hidden forever? The weight of that question lingers in the stillness of Gondolin's halls, where even the most joyful songs seem to pause just a breath too long. So let's wander together through these cobbled streets, past fountains that dance with starlight, and into the heart of a legend. For in Gondolin, every stone has a story. The smith's hammers ring with the crafting of treasures untold, and the laughter of children echoes like wind chimes. But beneath it all, there's a tension, a sense that time itself is holding its breath. Because beyond the mountains, in the far north, where the shadows cling thickest, Morgoth's armies gather. His spies scour the land, searching, always searching, for the one city he cannot find. And so, as we begin this tale, ask yourself, what would you sacrifice to protect something truly precious? That, perhaps, is the question that lingers in Gondolin's air tonight. The first snows had barely touched the encircling mountains when a lone figure appeared at the hidden entrance to Gondolin. A man, weary yet unbroken, with the salt of the sea still clinging to his cloak. This was Chuer, son of Chuer, last of his line, and the one Ulmo, Lord of Waters, had chosen as his messenger. The Vala's voice had guided him through treacherous paths, whispering in the rush of rivers and the crash of waves, until at last he stood before the 7 gates of Gondolin. The guards, their silver spears glinting in the twilight, hesitated. No mortal had ever breached these defenses, but Chuer bore the crest of Ulmo upon his shield, and his eyes held a fire that spoke of more than mere survival. He had come not for refuge, but with a warning one that would shake the very foundations of the hidden city. Inside the vaulted halls of the palace, King Turgan listened as Chuer spoke of gathering shadows beyond the mountains. Morgoth's spies, he said, had crept closer than anyone dared believe. Armies of orcs drilled in the wastelands, and winged creatures darker than storm clouds circled the northern peaks. But the lords of Gondolin shifted uneasily in their seats. To them, the city was a fortress beyond reach, its location a secret woven into the very fabric of the land. Had not the eagles kept watch for centuries, had not the mountains themselves shielded them, even as Chuer's words hung in the air, heavy with urgency, doubt crept in like frost on glass. Yet there was one who listened with a different heart, Idril, Turgan's daughter, watched the mortal man with a quiet intensity. Where others saw an outsider, she saw the hand of destiny at work. For years, a foreboding had stirred in her dreams visions of fire and falling stone. Now, as Chuer stood before her people, his voice rough with fatigue but unshaken in conviction, she understood. Gondolin's strength had become its weakness. Their pride and secrecy had blinded them to the storm, gathering beyond their walls. Time, as Chuer knew, was a thread fraying fast. Every sunset brought Morgoth's forces nearer. Every whispered denial among the Elven lords was a missed chance to prepare. He had crossed leagues of wilderness, evaded monsters and merciless terrain, not to deliver a message that would be dismissed like a beggar's rumor. The weight of his task pressed upon him, not just as Ulmo's herald, but as a man who had glimpsed the beauty of this city and could not bear to see it fall. The choice before Turgan was cruel: to append centuries of safety on the word of one mortal, or to cling to the illusion of invincibility until it was too late. And so, as torches flickered in the great hall and the lords debated, Chuer found himself standing at the crossroads of fate. The fate of Gondolin, hidden and shining, now rested on whether its king could hear the truth in a stranger's voice before the drums of war drowned it out completely. Idril's hands moved with quiet purpose as she traced the lines of a hidden map by candlelight, the parchment whispering against the marble table, while the lords of Gondolin clung to their unshaken faith in the city's impenetrable walls. She had seen the future in her dreams, flames licking at white towers, screams tangled with the roar of falling stone. Chuer's warning had been the spark, but it was her own foresight that fanned the embers of action. Beneath the floor of her private chambers, where even the most trusted servants seldom tread, the first stones were already loosened. A tunnel, narrow and secret, would wind its way from the heart of the city to the outer slopes of the encircling mountains. It was a betrayal of her father's will, yes, but what was disobedience weighed against survival? The work was slow, perilous. Every scrape of shovel against earth had to be muffled by layers of woven tapestries. Every bucket of displaced soil carried away under the guise of tending the palace gardens. Idril enlisted only those she trusted beyond doubt, a handful of craftsmen whose families had served hers for generations, their loyalty sealed not by oaths, but by shared silence. Yet even among them, doubts flickered. To undermine Gondolin's defenses, even in secret, felt like surrendering to fear. "My lady," murmured one silver-haired mason as they worked by lamplight one evening. If the king learned of this, Idril's reply was gentle but unyielding. "Let him rage at me when the city still stands to hear it." Word, as it always does, began to seep through the cracks. Whispers trailed Idril like shadows as she walked the colonnade's nobles exchanging glances, when she praised Chuer's counsel in court, or when she questioned the readiness of the city's granaries. Lord Meaglin, her cousin, watched her closest of all. His dark eyes missed nothing: the dirt beneath her fingernails, the way her robes seemed dusted with fine stone powder. Where others saw reckless defiance, he sensed calculation, and that frightened him more. If Gondolin fell, his power, his very place in the world, would crumble with it. The tension coiled tighter with each passing moon. At feasts where harp music once wove the lords together in unity, now silence pooled between their chairs. Turgan, though he loved his daughter dearly, could not ignore the murmurs of dissent. You divide them when we must stand as one, he murmured to Idril one night, his voice heavy as the crown upon his brow. She met his gaze without flinching. A single path leads only to ruin, Father. Should we not prepare for storms, even as we pray for clear skies? Her words hung in the air, unanswered. For the first time in centuries, the King of Gondolin felt the weight of his throne not as honor, but as chains. Meanwhile, deep beneath the city's gleaming surface, the tunnel grew longer. Idril's hands, once soft as lily petals, now bore calluses from the work. But every blister, every sleepless night, was a price she would pay 1,000 times over. Because in her dreams, the fire kept spreading, and in the waking world, far beyond the mountains, the drums of Morgoth's armies grew louder. Meaglin's fingers tightened around the hilt of his dagger as he watched Chuer cross the courtyard below, the mortals' laughter ringing too loudly against the marble walls. It was unnatural, he thought, how this outsider had woven himself so effortlessly into the tapestry of Gondolin, how the king's eyes brightened at his counsel, how the guards now nodded to him as if he were one of their own. But worst of all was Idril, the way her hand lingered on Chuer's arm, the way she leaned in to catch his words as if they held the secrets of the valor themselves. Every glance between them was a thorn in Meaglin's side, a reminder of what he could never have. For years, he had nurtured his ambitions like embers in the dark. The throne of Gondolin was his by right, he told himself. His father's bloodline, though stained by betrayal, still flowed through his veins. And Idril, she was the jewel of the Noldor, her grace unmatched, her wisdom a beacon. She belonged at his side, not with some ragged wanderer washed up by the sea. Yet the more Meaglin pressed his case in court, the more Turgan's patience wore thin. You speak of lineage as if it were a blade to wield, the king had sighed just that morning. But Gondolin needs more than claims of blood. It needs unity. The dismissal burned deeper than any insult. The mountains called to him then, as they always did when his anger threatened to boil over. The forges he tended in the foothills were his sanctuary, the roar of the fires drowning out the whispers of his discontent. But this time, as he worked the bellows, the shadows at the edge of the cavern seemed to stir. A figure emerged tall, cloaked in darkness, with eyes that gleamed like polished onyx. Morgoth's emissary spoke softly, venom wrapped in silk. Why grovel for scraps when the feast could be yours? The words slithered into Meaglin's mind, echoing his own thoughts back at him. Power, recognition, Idril, the promises were precise, each one a key turning in a lock he hadn't dared open. When the orcs seized him days later, dragging him into the bowels of Angband, Meaglin expected torment. Instead, he found himself kneeling before the Dark Lord himself, the air thick with the reek of sulfur and spoiled promises. Morgoth's voice was a landslide, crushing what little resistance remained. Gondolin's location for your life, he offered, or better yet for your crown. The throne room of his dreams materialized in the gloom, Idril beside him, her silver hair now shadowed by a circlet of black iron. The vision was a hook in his flesh, pulling him toward the unthinkable. Back in the city, no one noticed the change in him. Meaglin's smiles were still sharp, his counsel still laced with flattery. But behind his eyes, a new resolve took root. If Gondolin would not give him what he deserved, he would carve his own path, even if it meant letting the darkness in. Deep in the iron pits of Angband, where the air choked with ash and the very ground trembled under the weight of malice, Morgoth stirred. The knowledge of Gondolin's location burned in his mind like a fresh brand, a secret pride from Meaglin's lips, now fuel for his vengeance. His laughter, low and thunderous, sent ripples through the ranks of his generals. Let them sing their pretty songs a little longer, he mused, fingers curling around the armrest of his obsidian throne. Soon, their voices will be swallowed by fire. The forges of Angband roared day and night, their flames licking the sky as monstrous shapes took form. Dragons, their scales still gleaming with molten slag, stretched wings that blotted out the sun. Balrogs, wreathed in shadow and flame, sharpened their whips of fire. And the orcs legions upon legions, drilled in the wastelands, their crude armor rattling like the bones of the earth itself. Morgoth's strategy was deliberate, unhurried. He would not merely attack, he would erase Gondolin from memory, leaving only echoes where its towers once stood. Yet in the hidden city, the air remained sweet with the scent of blooming malorn trees. The elves of Gondolin, wrapped in their centuries of safety, prepared for the festival of Tarnin-Aosta, the gates of summer. Music spilled from open windows, and the streets shimmered with lanterns shaped like stars. King Turgan, though his brow bore the weight of Chuer's warning, allowed himself a moment of respite. Perhaps he dared to hope the storm would pass them by. Idril alone moved through the celebrations like a shadow. Her eyes, sharp as starlight, caught the unease in Chuer's posture as he scanned the mountain passes. She had seen the way Meaglin lingered at the edges of the feast, his smile brittle, his gaze darting toward the north, and in the quietest hours, when even the fountains seemed to hold their breath, she worked deepening the hidden tunnel, stockpiling supplies, whispering plans to those few she trusted. Far above the city, unnoticed by revelers, the eagles circled restless and watchful. Their keen eyes saw what the elves did not, the distant glint of armored columns snaking through the valleys, the unnatural stillness of the forests where no birds sang. But their warnings, carried on the wind, were lost in the laughter and harp song. The first sign came not with trumpets or war cries, but with silence. The night birds ceased their calls. The breeze died mid-whisper. Then, as the last notes of the festival's closing hymn faded, the northern horizon flickered, not with dawn, but with the glow of advancing torches. By the time the watchman sounded the alarm, it was already too late. The mountains, Gondolin's ancient guardians, now echoed with the tramp of iron boots. Morgoth's armies had found their way home. Turgan stood at the arched window of his high tower, fingers tracing the cool stone sill, as if he could measure the weight of his choices by its unyielding surface. Below him, Gondolin shimmered, a vision of white spires and winding streets, bathed in golden light, untouched by war or weariness. It was easy, in moments like these, to believe the city could endure forever. Chuer's warnings still echoed in the council chambers, sharp as a blade unsheathed, but the king's resolve had dulled with each passing day. "We have weathered darker storms," he murmured to his advisors, though the words tasted hollow even to him. Centuries of safety had woven a tapestry of certainty around his heart, and now, pulling at its threads, felt like unraveling the very foundation of his reign. Idril saw the hesitation in her father's eyes, the flicker of doubt, swiftly buried beneath duty. She pressed her case in private, her voice steady but insistent. "Father, the tunnels, Turgan interrupted, would be an admission that our walls are not enough." His hand gripped the back of his chair, knuckles whitening. "What message does that send to our people? That their king fears shadows?" The unspoken truth hung between them. To act on Chuer's warning was to acknowledge that Gondolin, for all its glory, was just another city in Morgoth's path. And that Turgan could not bear. Meanwhile, the lords of the city split like river currents around the growing tension. Some, like Icthelion of the Fountain, quietly doubled the guard at the lesser-used gates, his loyalty to Turgan unshaken, but his instincts honed by centuries of vigilance. Others dismissed the murmurs of danger as mortal folly, their laughter ringing too loudly in the feasting halls. "Let the birds fret over northern clouds," jested one silver-haired noble, raising his goblet. Gondolin stands beyond such worries, but Chuer, standing at the city's edge where the wind carried the distant scent of charred earth, knew better. The signs were there for those willing to see. The eagles circling tighter than before, the odd silence of the mountain foxes, the way the torchlight at night seemed to catch on something vast and winged far beyond the peaks. He had walked the wild lands, had felt the hunger in Morgoth's creatures. Their patience was not endless. Every sunset they delayed was a gift to the enemy. Yet the cruelest twist was this: Turgan's love for his city, so fierce it bordered on sacred, had become its greatest vulnerability. To him, Gondolin was not just stone and song. It was the last, brightest ember of the Noldor's hope. Admitting its peril would mean extinguishing that light in his own heart. And so, as the days slipped by, the king's orders remained measured, his proclamations cautious. Armories were stocked, but not hastily. Watchers were posted, but not doubled. It was the hesitation of a man balancing on a knife's edge, unaware that the blade had already begun to cut. High above, unnoticed by the sentries, the stars blinked out one by one, not by cloud or chance, but by the slow unfurling of vast, leathern wings. The drums in the north had fallen silent, not from retreat, but because the march was over. The armies had arrived, and Gondolin, wrapped in its king's unwavering faith, slept on. Meaglin returned to Gondolin as the first autumn mists curled through the mountain passes, his cloak damp with dew, and his expression carefully schooled into weary relief. The guards at the 7 gates welcomed him with clasped forearms, their relief genuine, and no one had known of his disappearance, only that he'd ridden to the eastern mines and taken longer than expected. But as they led him through the streets, their questions about his travels met with vague smiles and distracted nods. His mind was elsewhere, tracing the lines of a map only he could see, counting the weaknesses in Gondolin's armor like a thief testing locks. The days that followed were a masterwork of deception. Meaglin moved through the city like a shadow, his treachery wrapped in the guise of diligence. In the forge yards, he praised the smith's work, but quietly redirected their efforts. Swords meant for the armory were delayed for adjustments, and the alloy for new gate hinges mysteriously failed quality tests. When Lord Glorfindel voiced concerns about the northern watchtowers, Meaglin was quick to reassure him. "The mountains have shielded us for ages," he murmured, pouring wine with steady hands. "Would you insult them by doubting now?" His words were honeyed, but his eyes flicked toward the high passes, where the eagles no longer soared. Whispers began to coil through the council chambers like poison. Meaglin never spoke outright against Chuer or Idril, but his silences were artful. A raised eyebrow when the mortal's name was mentioned, a thoughtful sigh when Idril's tunnel was discussed, small gestures that let doubt take root in the minds of the lords. Strange, he mused aloud one evening, tracing the rim of his goblet. How quickly we're asked to trust outsiders over our own blood. The words hung in the air, festering. Idril sensed the shift, though she couldn't yet name its source. The masons who'd sworn secrecy to her now hesitated when she brought them supplies. The sentries at the lesser gates, once vigilant, grew lax under Meaglin's reassuring reports of quiet borders. Even her father, though he still embraced her each morning, had begun to glance at her plans with a furrowed brow. "You strain the people's faith," Turgan warned her softly. "Not everyone sees the world as you do," but the cruelest cut came on the eve of the attack. As Idril walked the ramparts, her fingers brushing the cold stone, she noticed the oil reserves for the signal fires were nearly empty. The watchman shrugged when she questioned them. Lord Meaglin said the barrels were leaking. One offered. He ordered them moved to the lower storerooms for repair. The lie was smooth, effortless. By the time Idril reached the storerooms, they were bare, and the northern sky was alive with the glow of torches, countless as stars. Meaglin stood atop the palace steps as the first screams reached the city, his face a mask of grim resolve. "To arms," he cried, the perfect picture of a loyal commander. But his hand, hidden in the folds of his cloak, clenched around a scrap of black silk, a token from Angband, a promise kept. The gates were unbarred, the guards out of position, the weapons just out of reach. And as the dragon's wings blotted out the moon, he allowed himself a single, silent thought. Let them see now who was right. Dawn broke not with sunlight, but with fire, a searing, unnatural glow, creeping over the mountaintops like spilled blood. The first sentry to spot it sounded the alarm, his horn's cry slicing through the morning stillness, but the warning came too late. Already, the distant shapes of dragons wove between the peaks, their wings casting jagged shadows over Gondolin's white towers. The city, so long cradled in secrecy, now lay exposed beneath a sky choked with smoke. Bells clashed in frantic chorus as elves spilled into the streets, their armor hastily fastened, their faces etched with disbelief. Children were swept into cellars, their questions met with hushed lies. "Just a drill," murmured mothers whose hands trembled as they lit the last of the household lamps. But no drill had ever made the earth shudder like this. No exercise sent avalanches of stone crashing down the slopes as Morgoth's siege engines found their range. The gates, those mighty barriers of steel and enchantment, groaned under the first hammer blows of the enemy. Cracks spider-webbed across their surfaces, and the defenders stationed there exchanged uneasy glances. Where were the reinforcements? Where were the reserves of oil to douse the attackers in flame? Too late, they realized. The barrels had been misplaced, the supply chains sabotaged by hands they'd trusted. At the palace, Turgan stood frozen for one terrible moment, his crown gleaming in the hellish light. All around him, advisors shouted contradictory plans: barricade the squares, rally at the fountain, evacuate the children. But the king's gaze was fixed on the northern sky, where the largest of the dragons circled like a vulture. He knew that silhouette, Ankalagan, he whispered, and the name alone was a dirge for all they'd built. Idril's voice cut through the chaos. She moved through the throne room like a blade unsheathed, her silver robes traded for mail, her hair braided tight for battle. The tunnel, she urged, gripping her father's arm. It's their only chance. But Turgan's eyes were those of a man already mourning. You go, he said softly. Lead them. A king does not flee his own city. Outside, the air itself seemed to scream. Balrogs, their whips of fire lashing the dawn, scaled the outer walls where the defenses were thinnest. Arrows glanced harmlessly off their hides, and the elves who met them sword to sword fell like wheat before a scythe. Panic, more lethal than any blade, spread through the streets. Some fought with desperate courage, rallying around Ecthelion's fountain, where the water ran red. Others ran blindly, their prayers lost in the cacophony of collapsing stone. And high above, unnoticed in the frenzy, Meaglin watched from a balcony, his face a mask of triumph and terror. This was his doing, and yet the fire did not discriminate. As the first tower toppled in a roar of shattered marble, he understood too late. Betrayal, once unleashed, could not be recalled. Chuer's sword flashed like liquid silver in the firelight as he stood shoulder to shoulder with the last defenders at the south gate. Around him, the air reeked of scorched stone and iron, the once proud archway now reduced to a jagged maw of broken teeth. Hold the line, he bellowed, his voice raw from smoke and shouting, but the words carried, not just as orders, but as a promise. These warriors knew him now, not as an outsider, but as the man who'd fought beside them in the training yards, who'd memorized every alley and stairwell of their city, as if it were his own. When he raised his shield to deflect a Balrog's whip, 3 elven archers instantly loosed arrows at the creature's eyes, their trust in his leadership absolute. Yet for every demon they felled, 3 more clambered over the rubble. The dragons had shattered the upper battlements, their molten breath turning marble to slurry, and now the streets became killing grounds. Ecthelion of the Fountain fought like a whirlwind at the square's center, his armor blackened, his famed water feature now a boiling pool from the heat of his enemies. Each time his spear found a Balrog's heart, the creature's death scream shook the ground, but the gaps in the ranks grew wider. A young lieutenant, her face streaked with soot, dragged Chuer behind a half-collapsed column as a dragon's firestorm raked the plaza. "We can't hold here," she gasped. Chuer knew she was right. The defensive circles were collapsing inward, the enemy herding them like sheep toward the palace steps. Somewhere in the chaos, a child's wail pierced through the clash of steel. Chuer's head snapped toward the sound. A boy no older than 5, crouched beneath an overturned cart, his eyes wide with terror. Without thinking, Chuer sprinted into the open, shield raised against the hail of arrows. He felt the impact before the pain, a searing heat along his ribs where an orc's spear grazed him, but he kept moving. Scooping the child into his arms, he turned just in time to see a Balrog loom behind him, its whip coiling for a killing strike. Then light, a blade of purest blue, cleaved through the demon's arm, and Idril stood there, her armor dented, her hair escaping its braid like a banner of gold. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The message in her eyes was clear. The tunnel, now, behind her, a ragged column of survivors pressed close, mothers clutching babies, old scholars with swords they'd never trained with, all following the glow of her lantern. Chuer hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to stand his ground, to buy these people seconds more with his own blood if needed. But the child in his arms trembled, and he understood. Sometimes, the bravest act wasn't dying where you stood, but ensuring others didn't. With a final glance at the crumbling gates, at the warriors still fighting beneath the fountain's broken statue, he turned and ran, not away from the battle, but toward the only future Gondolin had left. The city was falling, but its people, they still had a chance. The tunnel walls pressed close around Idril as she led the survivors forward, the damp earth muffling the distant screams of the dying city above. Her lantern cast flickering shadows on the faces of those who followed, mothers carrying infants too young to understand terror, elders leaning on the shoulders of grandchildren, warriors who'd abandoned their posts to guard this last thread of hope. Every few steps, the ground trembled as another tower of Gondolin collapsed, sending dust sifting through the ceiling like a grotesque mockery of snowfall. A child tugged at Idril's sleeve, his voice small in the darkness. "Will the king come with us?" She swallowed hard, adjusting the strap of her quiver where it bit into her shoulder. "He fights to give us time," she said, and the words tasted like ash. The passage twisted downward, its floor uneven where hasty hands had carved it through bedrock. Idril's fingers brushed the wall as she walked, tracing the gouges left by pickaxes, each mark a testament to her stubborn defiance. Months of secret labor, of blistered palms and whispered arguments, had all led to this moment. Yet now, with the weight of hundreds of lives behind her, the tunnel felt impossibly narrow, its ceiling too low. What if the enemy found the entrance? What if the mountain itself collapsed under Morgoth's fury? Her breath hitched, but she forced her steps steady. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. Behind her, a muffled sob echoed off the stone. A woman clutched a bundle to her chest, not a child. Idril realized with a pang, but a harp wrapped in homespun cloth, its strings silent. The sight cracked something open in her chest. These people weren't just fleeing for their lives. They were carrying fragments of a world that would never exist again. A scribe hugged a leather-bound tome to his ribs. A smith cradled a single hammer, its head blackened from the forges. Gondolin was burning above them, but here in the dark, its soul still flickered. A sudden roar shook the tunnel, sending pebbles skittering across the floor. The children whimpered, pressing closer to their elders. Idril froze, listening. That wasn't the sound of collapsing masonry. It was something alive, something hunting. The dragons had scented their escape. Her hand flew to the dagger at her belt, though she knew the gesture was futile. If the beasts found them here, buried like rabbits in a warren, no blade would matter. Then, from the shadows at the rear of the line, a voice rang out, clear and defiant. It was Chuer, his armor streaked with soot, his sword still dripping. He'd fought his way through the chaos to reach them. "The passage holds," he called, though his eyes told a different story. The enemy was close. Idril nodded once, her throat too tight for speech. As the last stragglers stumbled past her, she took a final glance up the tunnel's slope, where distant orange light licked at the darkness. Somewhere beyond that gloom, her father stood amidst the ruins of his dream. She whispered a promise to the empty air, not in Elvish, but in the tongue of mortals, the language of her husband and her son. "I will keep them safe." The tunnel curved sharply then, swallowing the last echoes of Gondolin's death throes. Ahead, a whisper of cold air brushed their faces the outer slopes, the hidden exit. Idril quickened her pace, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. They weren't free yet. The wilderness beyond these mountains was merciless, and Morgoth's scouts would already be circling like vultures. But for now, in this fragile pocket of darkness, the children's footsteps were still light with hope, and that, she vowed, would have to be enough. Turgan's fingers trembled against the cracked marble balustrade as he watched his city burn. The tower beneath him groaned, its foundations shuddering with each distant explosion, yet he stood motionless, a king crowned in smoke and regret. Below, the streets he'd walked for centuries writhed like living things, twisting under the weight of fire and iron. The fountain of the king, where laughter had once mingled with the splash of crystal water, now steamed with the blood of fallen warriors. Every scream that rose through the chaos was a needle in his heart. He'd been so certain, so sure the mountains and secrecy would shield them. Now, with the acrid wind tearing at his robes, he understood the cruel truth. Pride had been Gondolin's undoing. A hand gripped his elbow, Ecthelion, his armor scorched, his famed silver helm dented beyond recognition. "My lord," he rasped, voice raw from shouting orders over the din. "The western stair is still clear. Idril's people have a chance if we hold the palace a little longer." The unspoken plea hung between them, "Come with us." But Turgan shook his head, his gaze drifting to the northern sky, where Ankalagan, the black circled like a carrion bird. There would be no more running, no more choices deferred. The silence that settled over him then was stranger than any sound. No more counseled debates, no more weighing whispers against instinct. Only the crackle of flames and the distant wails of his people whom he'd sworn to protect. His fingers closed around the golden circlet on his brow, its weight suddenly unbearable. With a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted it away. The metal gleamed in the hellish light, still beautiful despite everything, a symbol of a kingdom that would outlive its king, only in fragments and songs. Somewhere beyond the smoke, a child's cry pierced the chaos. Turgan's breath caught. Idril would hear that sound too, wherever she was in the dark embrace of the tunnel. She would carry it, and all the others, into whatever future awaited them. That was her gift, to see beyond the crumbling present. His own role was simpler now. To stand as the flames climbed the tower walls, to meet the end he'd unwittingly crafted with every hesitant decree. The first tongues of fire licked at the tapestries behind him, their embroidered scenes of Gondolin's glory, curling to ash. Turgan didn't flinch. Let Morgoth take the city. Let him reduce its towers to rubble and its gardens to cinders. The memory of it, the idea of it, would outlast even dragon fire. As the heat seared his skin and the roof beams began to scream, the last king of Gondolin closed his eyes, not in fear, not even in sorrow, but in silent apology to the faces he'd loved, now scattered to the winds. Meaglin's back hit the jagged stone of the broken rampart, his breath coming in ragged gasps as Chuer advanced, sword gleaming with the reflected glow of the burning city. There was nowhere left to run. The secret stairway he'd planned to use was choked with rubble, and the screams of Gondolin's fall echoed around them like a dirge. His hands, usually so sure and cunning, trembled as they scrabbled against the wall behind him. "You don't understand," he hissed, eyes darting between Chuer's blade and the sheer drop at his back. "I could have saved us all." Power was the only language Morgoth understood. Chuer's face was unreadable in the flickering light, but his grip on his sword never wavered. the weight of every life lost, every child separated from their parents, every warrior who died defending sabotaged gates, hung between them. You sold them, Chuer said, voice low and terrible. Not for survival, for a throne. The words landed like hammer blows, stripping away Meaglin's last shreds of pretense. For a heartbeat, Meaglin's defiance flared. And what of your righteousness? He spat. You, who stole Idril's heart with your mortal frailty. You think love makes you nobler than ambition. But the venom drained from his voice as the reality of his situation crashed over him. The dragons circling above answered to Morgoth, not to him. The orcs surging through the streets wouldn't kneel to a traitor. His grand vision, the crown, Idril at his side was ash, just like the city he doomed. Chuer took a step closer. Look around you, he said, not with anger, but with a grief too vast for shouting. This is your legacy. Meaglin's gaze flickered over the ruins, the toppled statues of kings, the smoldering libraries where centuries of wisdom burned, the distant figures of elves leaping from crumbling towers rather than face the flames. Something in him fractured, not guilt, not quite, but the crushing weight of realizing too late that no throne was worth this emptiness. His lips moved, but no clever words came. Only a whisper, half lost in the roar of the fire. I only wanted. Chuer's blade flashed. The strike was clean, merciful in its swiftness. As Meaglin crumpled, his last sight wasn't of the crown he'd craved, but of the sky. The same stars that had watched over Gondolin in its glory, now veiled by smoke. His breath rattled, a final, broken sound. No one would mourn him. No songs would remember his name with anything but scorn. And as the darkness took him, the cruelest thought of all, Idril will live. She would survive and rebuild and love, all while his ashes mingled with the ruins of the city he'd loved too selfishly to save. The wind howled through the broken towers, carrying away the scent of blood and burning silk. Chuer turned without another word, stepping over the body of the betrayer. There were still lives to save, and the night was long. Cold mountain air bit at their faces as the survivors climbed, their breath puffing in ragged clouds against the starless sky. Behind them, the glow of Gondolin's ruin painted the cliffs in hues of orange and red, a funeral pyre for the once glorious city. Idril moved at the front of the ragged column, her lantern barely piercing the gloom, its light catching on the tear-streaked faces of children clutching their parents' hands. Every few steps, she glanced back not at the destruction, but at Chuer, who walked the line's end like a shadow, his sword unsheathed, his eyes scanning the rocks above for movement. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The understanding between them was as solid as the mountain beneath their feet. If even one more life was lost tonight, it would not be for lack of trying. The path was cruel, a narrow ledge of crumbling stone that wound upward like a serpent's spine. Idril's fingers brushed the cliff face as she guided them, her touch light but sure, remembering every twist and hollow from her secret surveys. Yet now, with hundreds depending on her, the route felt foreign, treacherous. A misstep, a loose rock, a moment of hesitation. Any could send someone tumbling into the abyss. Her pulse hammered when a young mother stumbled, her baby slipping from her arms. But Chuer was there before the cry left the woman's lips, catching the child mid-fall, his hands steady despite the blood drying on his sleeves. The look he exchanged with Idril then was more binding than any vow. We are still standing. So are they. Night deepened, and with it came the wind, a keening, icy thing that gnawed through cloaks and numbed fingers. The elderly struggled most, their breath labored, their steps faltering. One by one, the younger survivors took their arms, offering shoulders to lean on, sharing what little warmth they had. A silver-haired scholar, once a keeper of Gondolin's archives, murmured verses from memory as they walked, his voice a fragile thread of comfort. "Not all who wander are lost," he recited, and the words seemed to settle over the group like a shield. Then, from the darkness above, a sound that turned their blood to ice, the scrape of claws on rock. Chuer's sword was up in an instant, his body blocking the narrowest part of the path, as a winged shape blotted out the stars. But the attack never came. Instead, a familiar cry split the air, and the great eagle Landruvel circled once before alighting on an outcrop, his golden eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "East," he rasped, his voice rough as mountain stone. "The pass is watched, but the gullies are clear. Follow the stream when it forks at dawn. Relief washed through Idril like a tide." The eagles had not abandoned them. As the first hints of morning touched the highest peaks, the group reached a shallow cave, barely shelter, but enough to rest aching limbs. Idril knelt beside a spring that trickled from the rock, filling a cup for a child who hadn't spoken since the tunnel. The girl's hands shook as she drank, her eyes too old for her face. "Will the dark things follow us?" she whispered. Idril smoothed her hair, her thumb brushing soot from the child's cheek. "Not here," she lied gently. "This place is hidden, like Gondolin once was." The words tasted bitter, but the girl's shoulders relaxed. Sometimes hope was the only weapon left. Outside, Chuer kept watch, his back against the cave mouth, his gaze fixed on the distant smudge of smoke that marked all they'd lost. Idril joined him, her hand finding his in the space between heartbeats. Neither spoke of the future, of the wild lands ahead, the enemies still hunting, the weight of leading a people with no home. For now, there was only this, the warmth of their linked fingers, the quiet rhythm of their breathing, and the stubborn, unbroken truth that they were still alive. And sometimes, in the darkest hours, that was enough to begin again. The wind carried more than the bite of winter. As the refugees crept eastward, it carried the stench of charred flesh and the distant howls of wargs on the hunt. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent hands flying to sword hilts and children scrambling behind their elders. Chuer walked at the rear of the group, his ears straining for sounds beyond the ragged breathing of the survivors. They'd left the high passes behind, trading treacherous cliffs for the dense pine forests of Dimbar, but safety was an illusion. Morgoth's hunters didn't need torches or horns to track them. The blood in the snow, the soot on their cloaks, even the lingering terror in their whispers, all of it was a trail as clear as a banner in the wind. The first attack came at dusk, when the light bled purple between the trees. A volley of arrows hissed from the shadows, felling 2 elves before anyone could shout a warning. Chuer barely had time to shove a mother and her toddler behind a fallen log before the orcs surged forward, their jagged blades glinting. What followed wasn't battle, but butchery in the half-light. The refugees fought with whatever they had: kitchen knives, splintered branches, bare hands, while Idril's archers picked off foes from the rocks above. When the last orc fell, the silence was worse than the screams. They buried the dead quickly, with no songs or stones to mark the graves. Time was a luxury they couldn't afford. Days blurred into a nightmare of narrow escapes and dwindling supplies. a wounded warrior, sacrificed himself to lead a pack of wargs away from the group, his screams echoing long after he vanished into the mist. An old scholar, once famed for translating the ancient scrolls of Gondolin, quietly slipped away one night rather than slow the others down. His empty bedroll was still warm when they found it at dawn. Yet through it all, the children learned to walk without crying. The elders rationed their pain like water, and Idril's lantern never guttered out. She moved among them like a living torch, binding wounds with strips of her cloak, whispering plans for the next stronghold. Nan Tathrin, she'd murmur, painting pictures with her words, a valley of willow trees by the river where the grass grew tall enough to hide in. It might have been a fairy tale, but the way her voice didn't shake made it feel possible. Then came the rain. It fell for 3 days without ceasing, turning the trails to rivers of mud that swallowed their boots and sapped their strength. Fever spread through the group, and the coughs of the sick sounded like a death knell under the dripping trees. That was when the Balrog found them. It emerged from the deluge like a nightmare-given form, its whip of flame cutting through the downpour as if the rain itself feared to touch it. The refugees scattered, their screams swallowed by thunder. Chuer shouted for them to run, but where? The monster blocked the only path not choked by brambles. For a heartbeat, despair hung heavier than the storm clouds. Then a single arrow, fletched with swan feathers, sprouted from the Balrog's eye. Glorfindel stood atop a boulder, his golden hair plastered to his face, his bowstring humming. He'd been scouting ahead. How he doubled back so fast, no one could guess. Go, he roared, leaping down to meet the demon blade first. The clash lit up the forest like lightning, Glorfindel's sword meeting flame with starlight. No one saw the killing blow. By the time the survivors reached the ridge, panting and bleeding, all that remained was a scorched circle in the earth and a single, trampled circlet of golden flowers. That night, as the rain finally eased, Idril gathered the children to tell the story of the first sunrise in Valinor. Her voice didn't falter when she described the light, though her knuckles whitened around Glorfindel's circlet. The tale ended with the youngest refugee, a boy, who hadn't spoken since Gondolin's fall, lifting his head to ask, "Will it be morning soon?" And for the first time in weeks, the answer didn't feel like a lie. The scent of salt cut through the exhaustion, clinging to the refugees like a second skin. After weeks of stumbling through briar-thick forests and treacherous mountain passes, the sight of the sea stretched before them, vast and silver under the dawn light, stole the breath from their lungs. Waves lapped gently at the shore, their rhythm a stark contrast to the cacophony of Gondolin's fall. For the first time since the fire and smoke, the children dared to run ahead, their bare feet sinking into cool sand, their laughter ringing like wind chimes against the crash of surf. Chuer stood at the water's edge, the tide swirling around his boots. The weight of leadership had settled into his shoulders these past weeks, not with the grandeur of a crown, but with the quiet resolve of a man who'd buried too many friends. He'd learned to read the unspoken fears in the eyes of his people, the way the elders glanced at the horizon, as if Morgoth's dragons might darken it at any moment, the way mothers clutched their children tighter when the wind carried unfamiliar sounds. But here, with the sea's mist on his face, he felt something shift. The water murmured in a voice only he could hear, its cadence echoing the deep timbre of Ulmo's warnings from long ago. This far, no farther, it seemed to say. The Dark Lord's reach ended where the waves began. Behind him, Idril knelt in the shallows, her fingers trailing through the foam. The water shimmered where she touched it, a fleeting glow like submerged stars. The refugees whispered, some crossing their arms over their chests in reverence. Even now, ragged and road-worn, she carried Gondolin's grace with her, not in jewels or silks, but in the way she lifted her chin when the path grew steep, the way she'd traded her last loaf of whey bread for a feverish child's medicine. Chuer watched as she cupped a handful of seawater, letting it spill through her fingers like liquid moonlight. Her lips moved, though no sound escaped. A prayer, perhaps, or a promise. The moment shattered as a cry rang out from the rocks. One of the scouts came sprinting back, his face ashen. "Orc tracks," he gasped. "Fresh, they are following the riverbed." Panic rippled through the group, but Chuer was already moving, barking orders with a certainty that surprised even himself. The fishermen among them were sent to inspect the half-rotted boats beached along the shore. The archers scrambled to the high rocks, their arrows nocked. The wounded were carried to the tide pools, where the salt might cleanse their wounds, and through it all, the sea breathed against the sand, its rhythm steady, patient. As the sun climbed higher, a fog rolled in thick and sudden, wrapping around the coastline like a cloak. The scouts at the tree line blinked, disoriented. The orc tracks vanished as if the tide had erased them. The refugees huddled closer, their whispers tinged with awe. Ulmo's hand, murmured an old sailor, his knobby fingers tracing the sign of the wave over his heart. Chuer felt it too, a presence in the mist, a pressure in the air like the pause before a thunderclap. The Vala of Waters had not abandoned them. By dusk, the fog had woven a barrier so dense, the distant torches of orc search parties were reduced to hazy smudges, their guttural shouts muffled. The refugees slept fitfully on the sand, their dreams lulled by the sigh of the waves. Chuer kept watch beside Idril, their shoulders touching. "We can't stay here," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He nodded, his thumb brushing the crest of Ulmo on his battered shield. The sea might offer respite, but their path lay elsewhere, across the water, where the maps showed only blank parchment and the promise of shores untouched by shadow. When the first ship was deemed seaworthy, its hull patched with driftwood and hope, Chuer helped the children aboard, their small hands clinging to his as they stepped onto the deck. The oldest among them, a girl with her mother's eyes and her father's sword, strapped to her back, looked up at him. "Will there be monsters in the water?" Chuer crouched to meet her gaze. "If there are," he said, "we'll face them together." The sails caught the wind with a sound like a drawn breath. Behind them, the fog clung to the coast, a shroud over the past. Ahead, the open sea glittered with the reflection of 1,000 stars, each one a witness to the oath Chuer made silently as the shore faded from view. They would find home again, even if they had to build it from salt and stories. Years drifted by like leaves on a slow-moving river, and the tale of Gondolin's fall took root in the hearts of those who remembered. It grew beyond the raw sting of loss, beyond the ashes and the screams, into something both softer and sharper. A legend whispered around campfires, sung in the halls of new settlements, passed from elder to child with hands clasped tight. The survivors, scattered like seeds across the coasts and valleys, carried more than just the scars of that night. They carried the echoes of a city that had once shone brighter than the stars, and with it, the lessons etched in fire and blood. In the haven of Arvinian, where the sea whispered against the shore, the refugees built homes from driftwood and memory. The children who had trembled in the tunnel now stood tall, their laughter ringing through the salt air, though sometimes, when the wind blew just right, their elders would pause, eyes distant, as if hearing harp music from a dream. Idril and Chuer walked among them, their love a quiet beacon proof that even in the wreckage of all they'd known, something beautiful could take root. Their son, Arundel, grew up with stories of Gondolin's towers in his ears and the sea's call in his blood, a living bridge between the old world and the new. Yet the legend was not just one of sorrow. It became a mirror held up to the hearts of those who heard it. For some, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how pride could blind even the wisest rulers, how trust misplaced could unravel an entire kingdom. The name Meaglin was spoken rarely and only in hushed tones, a shadow to warn against ambition's poison. But for others, the story burned with a different light. It spoke of Glorfindel's last stand on the cliffside, of the mothers who'd shielded their children with their own bodies, of the smith who'd used his dying breath to bar a door against the enemy. These were not just endings, they were embers, carried forward to kindle courage in darker days. And so, though Gondolin's walls lay broken, its spirit refused to fade. The survivors wove its memory into everything they made a tapestry here, a melody there, the arch of a doorway, crafted to echo the lost city's grace. Even the youngest, who had no recollection of white towers or flowering courtyards, felt the weight of it in their bones. They knew, without being told, that they belonged to something vast and fragile and worth fighting for. The world moved on. New threats rose, old wounds scarred over, and the elves who had once wept for Gondolin found themselves facing fresh horizons. But in quiet moments, when the fire burned low and the night stretched long, someone would always lift their voice to sing of the hidden city, not as it fell, but as it had been in its golden prime. And for a little while, the past would breathe again, alive in the spaces between the notes. That was the true legacy of Gondolin, not just a warning, but a promise. That even the brightest light could be swallowed by shadow, yes, but also that from the darkest ashes, light could rise anew. The air reeked of sulfur and scorched metal as the dragon's shadow swallowed the narrow pass, its wings churning the coastal fog into a searing whirlwind. Chuer's sword arm trembled not from fear, but from the weight of the child clinging to his leg, her tiny fingers digging into his blood-stained greaves. Behind them, the last of Gondolin's survivors huddled in the rock clefts, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. There was no more tunnel to crawl through, no more hidden path. Only this, a sheer cliff at their backs, a monster before them, and the crashing sea far below. Idril stepped forward, her bowstring snapped moments before by the beast's tail, her quiver empty. Yet her voice cut through the chaos like a blade through smoke. "Look at me," she commanded, not to the dragon, but to the ragged line of defenders, a mix of silver-haired warriors and farmers armed with nothing but fishing spears. "You are the ones who carried the children through fire. You are the ones who outran shadows. This creature does not know what it means to face the light of Gondolin." The words kindled something in their eyes, a spark that had long been buried under ash and grief. The dragon lunged, its maw gaping, but Chuer was already moving. He didn't strike at the scaled throat, or the eyes, he drove his sword into the ground, wedging it between two jagged stones as the beast's momentum carried it forward. The creature shrieked as the blade caught the soft flesh beneath its jaw, anchoring it just long enough for Idril to act. With a cry that echoed her father's last defiance, she seized a fallen spear and plunged it into the dragon's nostril, where the hide was thin as parchment. The beast recoiled, its thrashing sending boulders tumbling into the sea. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sound like 1,000 swords breaking, the cliff edge beneath the dragon's claws gave way. The creature's wings flailed, but the weight of its own fury dragged it down, until the waves swallowed it whole. Silence followed, broken only by the distant sobs of a child and the rhythmic gasp of the tide. Chuer sagged to his knees, his fingers numb around the hilt of his shattered sword, but Idril was already turning, her hands outstretched to the survivors. "The path is clear," she said, though her voice wavered with exhaustion. "To the ships, to the future." One by one, they emerged from the rocks, not as refugees, but as something fiercer. A woman cradling a wounded comrade, a boy no taller than a spear, helping an elder to his feet. Their steps were slow, unsteady, but their heads were high. The dragon had taken the last of their fear with it into the depths. What remained was simpler, brighter, the unbroken truth that they had stood together, and that somewhere beyond the horizon, the dawn would still rise. The stars above the havens of Sirion burned brighter than they had in Gondolin, or so the children claimed, those who'd been small enough to mistake the city's torches for constellations. Time had softened the edges of memory, turning smoke and screams into stories told under the safe glow of hearthlight. Yet every now and then, when the wind carried the scent of salt and pine, the elders would pause, their hands stilling over looms or fishing nets, as if hearing echoes of a lost melody. Chuer saw it in their eyes, the way Gondolin lived on, not as a wound, but as a compass. Idril's hands, once calloused from digging escape tunnels, now shaped sails and charts, her vision stretching beyond the horizon. She taught the children to navigate by the same stars that had watched over their fallen city, turning each lesson into a quiet rebellion. "Remembering isn't about clinging to ashes," she'd say, knotting a rope with practiced ease. "It's about carrying the embers forward," and carry them they did into shipbuilding and songcraft, into marriages and new beginnings. The refugees became settlers, then storytellers, then something no one had dared to name yet, a people unbroken. Arundel, with his father's sea longing and his mother's sharp wit, grew like a sapling between two worlds. He played in the tide pools with other children, their laughter mingling with the gulls' cries, but his bedtime tales were of white towers and golden fountains. "Tell me about the king," he'd murmur, his small fingers tracing the embroidered crest on his blanket, a swan with wings outstretched, woven by hands that remembered. Chuer would smooth his son's hair and speak not of Turgan's end, but of his beginning, the hope that had built Gondolin stone by stone. Years later, when Arendel's own ship cut through the dawn mist, its sail silver with starlight, the old ones wept without shame. The boy who'd chased crabs on the shore now carried their collective light into the vast unknown, his prow aimed at the very heavens. Some called it fate. Idril called it choice. "We are not defined by what was taken," she told the villagers gathered on the docks, her voice steady as the tide, "but by what we dare to rebuild." And so the song of Gondolin, though changed, never truly ended. It hummed in the loom's rhythm, in the creak of ships' hulls, in the lullabies sung to grandchildren who'd never know a world without sunrises. The city's fall had been a crater, yes, but craters in time gather rain. They become lakes, then watering holes, then meeting places where travelers rest beneath unfamiliar stars and speak of homes they've loved and lost and found again. The night Arundel's star first flared in the sky, brighter than any beacon. A young mother in Syrian rocked her baby and whispered, "That's Gondolin saying hello." And perhaps it was. Kingdoms rise and fall, stone crumbles, and even the mightiest dragons turn to dust. But stories outlast them all. They slip into cracks and crevices, take root in unlikely places, and bloom when the world needs them most. So listen, the next time you hear the wind sigh through the pines, or the sea hum against the shore, you might catch a refrain of that old, stubborn melody, the one that refuses to let darkness have the last word.
you.